They said his body twisted in ways that didn't seem possible. Objects flew across the room and a priest was knocked to the ground by something no one could see. But nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared the world for what happened that night on March 16th of 1949 when everything came to a head. As the ritual started, the room shook with a strange energy, no longer sounding like his own. Spoken languages that he had never learned. His body jerked violently against the straps while the air filled with the foul smell of sulfur. Then, without warning, his skin moved. The word hell appeared burned in his chest, a horrifying message that no one could explain. This is the true story of Ronald Hunkeler, a boy whose suffering would inspire one of the scariest movies ever made, The Exorcist. But what really happened? And why was his identity kept secret for so long? Today we're going to reveal the truth behind the most well-known exorcism in American history. Welcome to Retraced Echoes. Roland had always been a quiet, well-behaved kid who kind of kept to himself. His life was pretty normal. Well, until January of that year, when his favorite Aunt Millie came to visit. Now, Aunt Millie was fun. She was a free-spirited woman with big interest in the occult. During her stay, she would introduce Roland to a strange new hobby, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead. She had been using it for years, and soon the two of them would spend hours together, their hands moving across the board, asking questions and waiting for answers from the other side. But what started as a simple game turned into something much darker. Now, on the night of January 15th, the family woke up to a very weird sound. It was a sound of water dripping. It was steady, it was constant. But when the family searched around the house, they couldn't find anything. There was no leaky faucets, there was no broken pipes. The sound seemed to be coming from the very walls of the home, as though something inside of it was crying. And every night, the strange dripping would continue over and over and over again. Then, just as suddenly as it all had began, the noise, it stopped. But the silence didn't bring them any kind of comfort. 11 days later, on January 26th, something absolutely terrible happened. You see, Aunt Millie died unexpectedly. There was no sickness, no warning. She was just gone. The shock hit Ronald hard. It was the first time death felt so real to him. The woman who taught him how to talk to spirits was now one herself. But was she really gone? Or perhaps she left something behind. In the days after her death, the house felt different. The air felt thick, almost like it was a buzz of something, some type of energy. Then the tapping started. As time would progress, it would get louder. It would become more forceful, like something was trying to break into their own world. The sounds would echo through the house every night, following them from room to room, always nearby and always watching. One night while the family was sitting in the living room, the picture of Jesus, it started shaking. I mean, at first it barely moved, but then it began to shake harder, like something was hitting it. They watched in fear as the picture banged against the wall, even though no one was near it. Ronald had been asleep in his room, completely unaware of what was happening, but things got worse. Chairs started moving on their own across the floor, making very creepy noises. The tables would shake, and then the unthinkable happened. Furniture began to float off of the ground as if they had no weight at all. Everyone just stood frozen, not able to believe what they were seeing. But the scariest moment is when Ronald, who was sitting in a very heavy wooden chair, was suddenly tipped over. He hadn't moved, and no one else was in the room. Now at school, it was clear that Ronald had changed. He used to be a quiet, hardworking student, but now he was withdrawn. His behavior had become strange. He barely spoke to anyone, and when he did, he would mumble things that his classmates couldn't understand. Instead of paying attention in class, he would stare off at the wall, his eyes looking far away like he was seeing something that no one else could. Before long, other kids started whispering about him. They called him the weird, strange, cursed kid. Even his teachers noticed the change. Now Ronald, who used to follow every single rule, was now disrupting class, speaking out of turn and acting more upset than ever. His parents was really worried, so they took him to the family doctor. But even though Ronald's behavior had changed so much, the doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. They assumed he was just high-strung. He's probably dealing with anxiety, or maybe he's just growing up. When you grow up, you have certain things that happen, especially as a teenage boy. Maybe that's what's going on. But Ronald's parents didn't buy it. They knew that there had to be something else going on, especially with all the strange things that was going on inside their home. But yet, they would ask for a little additional help, maybe someone else to see, and they would take the doctor's advice, and they would take him to see a psychiatrist. Now, Ronald, he would do a lot of psychological tests, but just like the doctor before, the psychiatrist couldn't find any reason for what was happening. He's just energetic, they would say. He's going through the ups and downs of puberty. But these explanations, they didn't feel right. Not with the creepy things that was going on around Ronald that no one could possibly explain. What the professionals said didn't match the scary reality his family was dealing with at home. Then on January 26th, exactly 1 month after Aunt Millie suddenly had passed away, things got worse. Ronald's family, desperate for answers, turned to the Ouija board yet again. This time they was hoping to contact Aunt Millie. They weren't just curious, they expected some kind of response. Since they had practiced spiritualism with Aunt Millie, they believed that communication from the other side was possible. But instead of hearing from Aunt Millie through the board, something even more disturbing happened. It was as if whatever was trying to communicate did so through Ronald's body. Strange scratch-like marks, which had first appeared just a few days earlier, started showing up far more often, and no one could explain how they got there. These weren't normal scrapes from a kid playing. These were long, jagged lines that cut across the skin with no clear reason. Even worse, scratches formed of words, symbols, and phrases as if someone was trying to send a message directly through him. Ronald's parents were no longer just worried. They were scared. They had seen the marks form right in front of their very eyes. They had heard the scratching sounds late at night, only to find new wounds on Ronald the next morning. The doctors couldn't explain it. The psychiatrist thought that Ronald was just scratching himself because of stress, but how could anyone explain the words scratched into his skin like they had been carved by an invisible hand? The mysterious scratches, they happened more and more often, usually when Ronald was alone in his room. His parents would hear the faint sound of scratching, slow and creepy, followed by Ronald crying out in pain. But when they would run into his room, they always found him alone, scared and shaking with fresh wounds marked on his skin. Ronald's behavior was getting more and more unpredictable. With the scratches and the moving furniture and the scary things that was happening at night, his parents began to face the terrifying reality that this might not be about spirits at all. They started to wonder if maybe it was something evil like a demon that had gotten a hold of their son. And since they couldn't get answers from their doctor or their psychiatrist, or to be honest, anything that had to do with scientific measure, they turned to their pastor, who was a Lutheran minister. But the pastor, he didn't know anything about what to do. In the Lutheran faith, there wasn't a tradition for dealing with demonic possession or performing exorcisms. The family wanted spiritual guidance, but their pastor couldn't give them any kind of help, especially not the kind that they needed. Things were starting to get worse, and the family was losing hope. Now, even though their pastor cared about the situation, he did not have experience to deal with whatever kind of negative, dark forces was attacking their son. However, he knew of a group that had handled this kind of experience before. That group was called the Catholic Church. So, following the advice of their pastor, the family would reach out to a Catholic priest. His name, Father Bowden, who was known for his understanding of spiritual matters. After hearing about everything that was happening with Ronald, the strange scratches, the weird noises, and the objects moving on their own, the father, he realized that these were signs of possession. Since the family hadn't found any answers through science or medicine, the father believed that they were dealing with perhaps something that was more supernatural. It was a serious decision, but Bowden knew that he couldn't avoid it. I mean, with Ronald's condition, it was getting worse and worse, so Bowden would ask the Archbishop in St. Louis for permission to perform the ancient rite of exorcism. Now, exorcisms was almost unheard of in America, especially in the 20th century, but this case, we see this case, it was different. After a lot of consideration, the Archbishop agreed to Bowden's request, but under one very strict rule. Every single detail of the exorcism, it had to be recorded day by day without leaving anything out. To help with this, Father Bowden brought in Father Raymond Bishop. Not only would Bishop assist in the ritual, but he would also have to keep a very detailed journal of every strange thing that happened, no matter how small. This journal, it would later become one of the most important records of this terrifying event, and it also inspired the movie, The Exorcist. Now, Bowden wasn't experienced with performing exorcisms, so he would turn to a 400-year-old Latin book that contained the official rites of the Catholic Church. Now, in his worn pages, he found exactly what he needed: guidance on how to draw the evil out of Ronald. The book listed the very clear signs of possession: speaking in foreign languages, knowing future events or secrets, and showing superhuman strength. Now, Ronald was showing all of these signs. Even though the exorcisms was rare and only used as a last resort, Bowden knew this was his only choice that he had left. The days ahead would be unlike anything Father Bowden had ever experienced. Though trained as a priest, nothing had prepared him for the battle that he was about to face. This wasn't just a spiritual challenge, it was a war against the devil and himself. With the strength of his faith, Father Bowden, with Father Bishop by his side, he prepared for the long and frightening struggle ahead. The ritual gave very clear instructions. Exorcisms, they had to be done with a strong, clear voice, the crucifix held firmly. If the possessed person's body acted strangely, the priest would make the sign of the cross and sprinkle holy water on the affected area. The ancient ritual, passed down through centuries of Catholic tradition, was now being performed in Ronald's room. Father Bowden and Father Bishop had come back to face what they believed was pure evil. The room felt heavy, like something bad was lurking there, unseen. Bowden, holding his crucifix and holy water, began saying the exorcism prayers, his voice steady and strong, calling for the power of God. But almost right away, Ronald's behavior changed. His eyes grew dark, his face twisted with anger, and his voice distorted. Father Bishop's journal later described what happened next. Ronald's strength became unnatural, Human, they would say. He fought with such force that the priests, full-grown men, struggled to hold him down. It was as if something much more dangerous than a child was fighting them. But Bowden kept going, his voice a steady chant against the chaos that was taking over the room. Now, hours went by as the battle between the priest and the unseen force stretched into the night. Ronald's body shook, his cries growing more desperate. The sound of his struggle echoing through the room. Then at 1 a.m., something changed. Ronald gasped. His furious expression turned to confusion. "Open the window," he whispered, sounding like he was fighting off nausea. "He's going." "He's going," Ronald said weakly, his voice quiet and distant, no longer filled with rage. Bowden leaned in close. "Who's going?" he asked. But Ronald didn't answer. His body relaxed, his face softened, and for the first time in hours, the room was quiet. A heavy feeling in the air, it lifted, leaving behind a strange stillness. Ronald's family, overwhelmed with the relief, they knelt beside his bed and prayed with the priest in thanks. Bowden, exhausted, began to believe that they had won, that the evil was gone. But as Bowden reread the warnings from the ritual, he felt uneasy. The old text had a very serious warning. See, the devil is clever. It said that a demon might pretend to leave, creating a false sense of peace to trick the exorcists into letting down their guard. The victory, it warned, could be a trick. Bowden knew better than to trust the calm. His fears would be confirmed just a few hours later, about 3 o'clock in the morning, when Ronald called out in a shaky voice. He would say, "Mom." His mother rushed to the side of the bed, her heart racing. "He's coming back," Ronald whispered. His voice was trembling with fear. Her hand shook as she asked, "Who's coming back?" Ronald's wide, terrifying eyes met hers. His face was pale, drained of color. "He's coming back," was all that he could say. The brief moment of peace was gone. Bowden was called back to Ronald's side, his mind racing with the realization of the truth. You see, the battle was not over. The demon had not been defeated. It had only stepped back, waiting to return stronger. The fight for Ronald's soul would continue, and Bowden knew his faith and the endurance were about to be tested like never before. On the evening of Sunday, March 20th, Father Bishop's journal recorded a very terrifying new level of activity. At exactly 8:15 p.m., Ronald flew into a violent tantrum, more intense than anything the family of the priest had ever seen. His body thrashed uncontrollably. His screams were wild, and strength seemed impossible to explain. The witnesses were horrified by what they were seeing. They whispered that it didn't seem like the boy in front of them was there anymore. It felt like the devil was taking over. By this point, Ronald's family was at the breaking point. The violent episodes, they never stopped. The mysterious scratches, they kept appearing on his body. And the tantrums. The tantrums were getting worse every single day. They couldn't take it anymore. They were desperate. They were exhausted. They would go to Father Bowden and they would beg for help to end the nightmare. Now, Father Bowden, he knew that it was time for drastic action. The rites of the ritual, they were clear. If possible, the exorcism should be moved to a private, sacred place, somewhere away from curious onlookers. A place like this would give the privacy needed for the ritual and might even weaken whatever dark force had a hold on Ronald. That place was the Alexian Brother Hospital, in St. Louis, a Catholic hospital that was ran by monks. Now, the hospital had a special wing that was designed for patients who were dangerous or perhaps hard to control. Now, the rooms, they had locks on the doors, and there was a steel mesh that was over top of the windows, creating a secure space for Ronald's safety and to keep whatever was inside of him trapped. Now, when Ronald was admitted to the hospital, it felt like he was falling deeper into a nightmare. The hospital listed him as a psychiatric patient, but to the priests and to the monks, this wasn't about mental illness. For them, they believed they was in the fight. A fight that was a spiritual battle, a war for Ronald's body and for his soul. They thought that the devil was trying to destroy him from the inside, pulling him further into the darkness with each and every passing day. Medical treatments didn't help. Sedatives and restraints and psychological evaluations, they didn't make any difference. Each failed attempt to explain or to possibly cure Ronald only convinced the priests and the monks that there was definitely something supernatural that was happening. This wasn't about science anymore. It had never been about science in their mind. It was a battle of the wills, and only one side could win. For the priests, this was no longer about Ronald's safety. It was a fight for his soul. On March 22nd of 1949, Father Bowden knew that the fight against the force that was tormenting Ronald, it was only getting worse. So he'd have to call for a little bit of extra help. One of the people that came to help him was Walter. He was a young seminary student at the time. Now, his job was relatively simple. The only thing he had to do was physically hold Ronald down during the exorcism. Now retired, he is the only living witness to the events. Thinking back on his role, he would say, "My main job was just to hold him down. Sometimes between the prayers, I'd talk to Ronald and try to calm him down. The exorcisms was long and exhausting, but strange things often interrupted the rituals. In one case, Father Bowden had just blessed Ronald with some holy water. He would place the bottle on the dresser. As Walter kneeled at the foot of the bed, the bottle would fly right past him and slam into the wall. No one was near it to throw it. Later, Walter would admit, this was the first sign to me that this was a case of possession. There was no explanation for it, it just happened. And from that point on, Walter was convinced that something evil was at work. Now, during the exorcism, Ronald, whether possessed or influenced by the entity, he would begin shouting curses and insults at the priests. Father Bishop's journal described these outbursts as filthy and offensive, filled with shocking references to body parts and sexual acts. In 1949, this type of language was deeply offensive. For many involved, Ronald's obscene behavior was seen as pure proof of demonic possession. It seemed like Ronald, or possibly something that was speaking through him, was trying to upset or provoke the people that was around him. Now, the violent episodes that got worse, Ronald would thrash and kick and spit at the priest, so much so that all three men would typically try to hold him down. Walter would remember times when Ronald would accuse him of hurting him. You have to remember, this is just a 14-year-old boy. He'd say, "Ow, ow, you hurt my arm, you hurt my arm." And the moment that he would release his grip, well, Ronald would attack. He would immediately hit Walter. This made it so as that Walter was absolutely sure that this was no mere 14-year-old boy. Now, despite the bad language and the violent behavior, Father Bowden stayed focused on the exorcism. But sometimes doubt crept into his mind. The ritual said that the exorcist should be a man of strong faith and good character. Bowden oftentimes wondered if he was strong enough to beat such a powerful force. Now, during the exorcism, Father Bowden, he kept up with his regular pastoral duties, but the ritual was ongoing. It was wearing him down both physically and mentally, and even though he tried to stay calm on the outside, the stress, it was just exhausting to him. He was always worried. He was always wondering if maybe there was something else that he could do to try to help this boy. Now, according to Father Bishop's journal, Bowden looked tired. Some nights it would feel like they were making huge progress, and other nights it was like they were stuck. One night, Ronald had several episodes of uncontrollable urination. Now, that was a very disturbing sign that left the priest and the family feeling discouraged. The stress was so bad that Ronald's mother, she thought about stopping the entire exorcism and just taking him home. She kept telling him that they would be home soon, but those words, they felt empty as the nightmare continued. Meanwhile, Bowden, he followed the instructions of the ritual, which said prayer and fasting were important tools for fighting demonic forces. Bowden took this very seriously, oftentimes fasting to the point of being physically weak. Now, even though he was hungry and tired, he kept going, knowing that the prayer was the only weapon against this evil spirit. And as the exorcism went on, a disturbing pattern started to show. Ronald's violent outbursts, they got worse whenever Bowden mentioned God's name. His screams and thrashing became more intense, as if the very thoughts of God made this demon inside Ronald furious. One night, Ronald asked for a pencil. According to the journal, he wrote the chilling words, "I am the devil himself. In 10 days, I will give a sign." Bowden was disturbed by this, but chose not to respond. The ritual gave a very strict warning not to talk to the devil, so Bowden didn't ask any questions or try to get any kind of explanations. He just focused. He focused on saying the prayers, refusing to let the demon trick him into conversation. At a key moment, Bowden made a very bold move. He would ask Ronald if he had ever been baptized. When Ronald hesitated, Bowden offered to baptize him again, seeing it as a very powerful way to fight the demon. You see, baptism, which is the first sacrament of Christianity, is also considered a kind of exorcism. Ronald agreed, and Bowden performed the baptism. While baptizing him, Bowden asked, "Do you renounce Satan?" Ronald struggled but managed to say, "I do renounce." Bowden then baptized Ronald in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, hoping that it would protect Ronald. But what should have been a joyful and sacred moment quickly turned into a nightmare. Even after the baptism, Ronald's torment continued. Father Bishop's journal said that right after the baptism, Ronald went right back to spitting and thrashing and cursing and using obscene language, and it lasted and went on late into the night. Now, belief in the afterlife, it oftentimes brings comfort, a way to try to calm the fear of death. But you see, in Ronald's case, the darkness in those beliefs, it became very real. After his baptism, there was a very brief moment of peace. During the day, Ronald seemed calm and even helped out around the hospital. But every single night, the priest would start the exorcisms all over again. And it was almost like the evil would return and would be even stronger than the last time they were there. Ronald began acting in strange and frightening ways. He would spit at the priest and he would swing at them with unnatural strength, as he always had, but somehow he would have his eyes tightly closed, and it was like each one of his punches would hit the mark every single time, almost like there was an invisible force that was guiding each one of his punches. Now, the priest that was led by Father Bowden, they would have to deal with this every single time they would come to the hospital. And they would get there about 8 o'clock every single night. They were always tired, but they were determined. They wanted to save this little boy. Now, one night in particular, Bowden would greet Ronald when he would walk in. He'd say, "Hello, Ronald, how you feeling today?" For a moment, Ronald answered in a strangely peaceful tone. He would say, "I'm fine." But as soon as the prayers began, the room felt different. It felt heavy with a dark energy, and suddenly something terrifying appeared, etched on Ronald's chest in large, jagged letters, the word exit. The letters was cut into the skin and dripping blood, a terrifying sign that the evil, it wasn't gone. Shaken but not given up, the priests continued their prayers with a ritual with every single ounce of their being, and they were even more determined. Ronald's body twisted in painful and natural ways, a deep, evil laugh filling the room. It wasn't Ronald's laugh, it was something much darker and something much older. Father Bishop's journal had described the moment clearly. The devil speaking through Ronald taunted the priests. "He only has to say one more word. He'll never say it. He only has to say one more word, but he'll never say it." The priests were confused. What word could the demon possibly mean? They would sit there and think about this for what felt like for hours. And then it hit them. Lord. The demon was trying to stop Ronald from saying the name of God. With renewed strength, the priest began saying the Lord's name over and over and over again. The more they would say it, the more Ronald's body would just reek with just anger, his voice growing crazier. Then in a shocking moment, Ronald's eyes flew open and he shouted, "It burns!" His face twisted in pain as he described the vision of Saint Michael, the archangel. According to Father Bishop's journal, the voice of Saint Michael broke through the madness, speaking through Ronald as his body shook. "Satan, it's Saint Michael," the voice commanded. "I demand you, Satan, with all your other evil spirits to leave this body in the name of the Lord. Immediately, now, now, now." Ronald's voice was frantic as he described the vision unfolding before him. He saw Saint Michael and the devils locked in a fierce battle near the opening of a fiery cave. The flames roared around them as the archangel fought the dark force. In the end, St. Michael won, throwing the devil back into the fire from where it came. The battle was over. A few moments later, Ronald took communion from Father Bowden. The act was a sign, a final step to cleanse him from the darkness that had haunted him for so long. But just as the wafer touched his lips, a loud sound shook the hospital. The noise echoed through the walls, rattling the windows and the doors, but there was no sign of an actual explosion. Across the street at a nearby church, people said they heard the same mysterious blast as a sound. It very softly faded. Hospital lights flickered and they went out, leaving everything in darkness for just a moment. When the lights came back on, Ronald sat up in bed, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. He looked around, calm, and said quietly but firmly, "He's gone." Father Bowden stood still, his heart pounding. He took the strange events, the loud blast, the flickering lights, and Ronald's sudden clarity as a sign the battle was over. The demon had been cast out after 4 long weeks, 4 long, exhausting weeks of exorcisms. Ronald was finally free of the possession that had nearly destroyed him. Ronald was sent home, his body and soul no longer under the dark grip of the demon. For the priests, it was a moment of victory, a hard-earned win in a spiritual war they had fought with every bit of the faith that they had. Ronald, the boy whose terrifying experiences led to one of the most famous exorcisms in history, went on to live a very quiet and private life. After what happened in 1949, he became a Catholic and left the horrors of his past life behind. As an adult, Ronald chose a career in science of all things. a path far from spiritual battles that he had faced when he was young. He eventually settled in the eastern United States, where he would build a life with a family and a career. Now, somehow people say that Ronald had absolutely no memory of the terrifying events that took place during his possession or his exorcism. See, for him, the past was just a closed chapter, one that he would never have to revisit. But for Father William Bowden, see, he carried the weight of those nights with him until he passed away. He would die in St. Louis in 1983 at the age of 86, and he kept silent about the experience that he had with Ronald. Bowden never spoke publicly about the ordeal, and it was only through the detailed journal that anyone learned about the exorcism or Bowden's even role in the exorcism at all. Walter, the young man that was a seminary student, the one that would physically hold down Ronald during the exorcism, he would later become an army chaplain in Vietnam. After seeing the horrors of war, Walter turned to teaching, and he stayed in education until he retired. When he was asked years later about the exorcism, he remained relatively modest in what he did. "I'm not really an expert in the field," he said. "It was just a situation we were faced with, and we used prayer to handle it. And in the end, it worked." Now, even though Walter's words were simple, they came from someone who had seen something that couldn't easily be explained. In 1999, 385 years after the ritual was first written, the Vatican updated the ancient text. Now, these changes reminded priests to be careful when considering whether cases of possession might actually come from physical or mental illness. A reminder that the line between the spiritual and the medical issues, well, they can oftentimes blur. Even with these modern updates, the Vatican continued to stand by their belief in the devil, stating clearly, anyone who says he doesn't exist would not have the fullness of the Catholic faith. The Church made it clear, belief in the devil is connected to the belief in God. One cannot exist without the other. Now, for many, Ronald's case is a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that still may be at work. As one person put it, if you believe in the devil and you see the devil, then there must be God. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. Now, Ronald's case is still one of the scariest exorcisms in history. A fight between good and evil carried out in the shadows. Story and timeless effort of those who work to save him. It reminds us that dark forces, they might exist just beyond what we can understand. Now, if you've had a strange experience that you can't explain, I would love it if you tell me in the comments down below. And if you don't feel good about putting it there, you can also send it to my email, info@retracedechoes.com. Who knows? Maybe your story will find its way to a podcast just like this one. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you've not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. For those of you that do not listen on the YouTube machine, definitely check us out on YouTube. We're not just doing podcasts over there. If you enjoyed this podcast, check out my other podcast I do with a friend of mine. His name is Nick. It's called Deceptive Realities, just like the old Unsolved Mysteries with good old Robert Stack. Who knows? Maybe you'll find another favorite story over there. I want to thank you all for being here. Until I see you next time, goodbye.